There's no escaping Pokemon.
So, to most of the world, Game Freak is nothing more than just the Pokemon guys. But looking back, it quickly becomes apparent that they're so much more than that. Like, they were technically one of the first indie studios that, against all odds, managed to commercially release a game in a time when the indie scene, as we know today, was basically non-existent. A once struggling studio that's somewhat become a victim of their own success in recent years, and is now struggling to find recognition in a franchise they can truly call their own. This is the story of Game Freak beyond Pokemon. So it all started back in the 80s, when Game Freak was nothing but a simple, self-published, handwritten, and hand-stapled fan magazine by Satoshi Tajiri, and later artist Ken Sugimori. Now, due in part to video game media not really being a thing back then, Game Freak quickly received a very dedicated cult following, with one of its most popular issues selling over 10,000 copies. That's a lot of staples. While they appreciated the success, their goal was always set on eventually creating their own games. However, for a small independent group like Game Freak, this wasn't going to be easy. Due to how costly arcade development was, and with Nintendo requiring studios to have a contract with them to legally put anything out on their platform, a small group like Game Freak commercially releasing a game back then was basically impossible. Which meant they would have to get a bit creative if they ever wanted any hope of breaking into the industry. So Tajiri got to work studying the recently released Family Basic system, which transformed the Famicom into a basic home computer and allowed users to create simple programs. He then took apart a retail Famicom, and through some modifications and a couple Apple II computers, Tajiri was able to put together a completely homebrew Famicom development kit. I did that too, and all I got was a fucking mess. After about 2 years of part-time work, they finally had a working prototype. But there was one massive roadblock in their way if they wanted to continue development. They still lacked any kind of contract with Nintendo, which would prevent them from ever officially selling the game. Their only option was to pitch what they had to a third-party publisher, one that already had a contract with Nintendo. One of their first choices was Namco, who they personally held in high regard. Now, even though Game Freak wasn't officially a studio yet, Tajiri actually managed to set up a meeting with Namco, and after some convincing, they agreed to license the game. On one condition. They needed Game Freak to become an official company for them to strike a deal. So with some funding secured from Namco, they finished up the game, and on April 26, 1989, Game Freak became official, and 2 months later, their first game, Quinty, would be released on the Famicom. The game is a simple one-screen puzzle game in which you flip floor tiles to trip enemies into walls. The goal is to defeat every enemy in a room without getting hit. There's also special tiles, which you can step on for points, lives, or even tiles that flip every other tile in a room, leading to some pretty interesting strategizing. Overall, it's a simple, easy to understand game that, while frustrating at times, is still a lot of fun, especially with 2 players. It also features some of Pokemon composer Junichi Matsuda's earliest work, and it's pretty good stuff. So yeah, while Quinty on its own is a fairly simple and unassuming game, it's everything else surrounding it that makes it so damn interesting. Like the fact that this small group of friends just chipped away at this game with no funding, no experience, no anything really, is just straight up inspirational. There wasn't even any guarantee they'd be able to sell the game by the end of it without that contract from Nintendo. But still, they pressed on just because they loved doing what they were doing. Artist Ken Sugimori would even take the time to make an entire manga out of the game to help promote it. They really went above and beyond for this project. So Quinty, and later Mendel Palace, as it was known in the West, went on to become a modest success. Nothing groundbreaking, but it was enough to get their foot in the door of the video game industry. It wasn't long after this that Tajiri would start on his next game, one that would kickstart Game Freak into becoming the behemoth we know today. So yeah, soon after Quinty's release, Tajiri had an idea for a new game. One where you could train these little monsters and trade them with friends. He called it Capsule Monsters. No idea if that'll go anywhere. But Tajiri was extremely passionate about this idea. However, there was a huge problem. Game Freak wasn't really swimming in cash at this point. Tajiri repeatedly struggled to pay himself and his employees. It got to the point where basically every programmer straight up quit mid-development on his dream project. Game Freak wasn't just a group of friends hanging out making a game anymore. They were an official company now and needed to do real big boy company things, like, pay people. So Tajiri had to put his Capsule Monsters passion project on the back burner while he picked up other projects from various publishers to fund the studio. The first of these projects was Smart Ball was originally released in 1991 in Japan under the title Jerry Boy. The game was published by Sony Records, who also helped develop the Super Nintendo sound chip. The story goes that Sony Records wanted to have a few games ready at the system's launch that could show off the performance of this new sound chip. So they opened up submissions for game ideas that could fit the bill, and God help us, your boy was selected. The game is actually pretty ambitious with its story, stage variety, and even towns you can visit. It gives this game an almost RPG-like feeling. It's pretty cool. But then you actually play the game and yeah, your boy done fucked it. Jerry Boy feels pretty awful to play. Platforming is extremely stiff. Jerry being a blob means he can't really do much besides squish and stretch to defeat enemies, which never feels reliable. And you can stick to walls. Sometimes. It's okay. He's in hell now. It's a shame because honestly, there's a lot of potential here, and similar to Quinty, Jerry Boy has that same extreme sense of passion in it. They could have made this just another basic platformer, but instead they went above and beyond again, including all these cool extras like the story, towns, and also similar to Quinty, Ken Sugimori made another manga to promote this game as well. Even though this was done just as a side project to fund the studio, Game Freak's passion for their work still shines through here. Then the game was localized as fucking Smart Ball, and all that passion was sucked right out. Yeah, no towns, no story, none of that. I'm assuming they scrapped all this just because they didn't want to translate all the text. Regardless, it's just a more bland version of the original. Yeah, don't let them fool you, that ain't your boy. So yeah, as Game Freak's second game, it's not terrible and has a lot of charm. However, it's obvious this game was rushed, probably to meet the Super Nintendo's launch. Which is a shame. If it was given a bit more time to cook, this could have been an amazing little gem on the Super Nintendo. There was even a planned sequel, which was basically finished. But possibly due to Sony's and Nintendo's falling out surrounding the Super Nintendo's disc add-on, this sequel was unfortunately scrapped. But none of this really mattered in the end, because their next project they had lined up was going to be massive for them. Yeah, Yoshi, that simple little puzzle game you've probably seen once or twice and completely ignored. Game Freak made that, and it was arguably their big break. Yoshi was Game Freak's first project made in collaboration with Nintendo. It all started when Tajiri showed his Capsule Monsters concept to Ape Inc., later known as Creatures Inc., which was recently founded by Nintendo and mother creator Shigesato Itoi. This company was focused on finding new talent in the games industry, and Tajiri saw this as a perfect way to get his Capsule Monsters project off the ground. While they liked his idea, they felt Game Freak lacked the experience to tackle something that ambitious. That's when they told Game Freak that Nintendo was looking to make a new puzzle game starring Yoshi. However, the project needed to be completed in just 6 months. Despite this, Game Freak stepped up to the plate, finished the game on time, and in the end, left Nintendo fairly impressed. The game is really nothing special, but would still go on to be a massive success, topping sales charts around the world during its initial release. Yoshi not only helped with Game Freak's financial troubles, but it also helped form what is arguably their most important relationship, as well as proving that they were more than capable of designing games professionally. Next up was Magical Taruruto-kun. It's a licensed game based on a kid's show. Honestly, I didn't have too high of hopes for this one. I mean, come on. We all know how this licensed game shit goes. But this ended up becoming one of my favorite Game Freak games. This was Ken Sugimori's directorial debut, and despite Game Freak's newly formed relationship with Nintendo, this game was made for Nintendo's rival platform, the Sega Mega Drive. It's honestly just a pretty basic platformer, but it's got a ton of charm in it. You can bring random objects to life and throw them at enemies, you have a few special magical skills, and there's this really cool glide ability which allows you to just blow through levels if you know how to use it. This feels like it'd be a pretty fun game to speedrun. When it comes to licensed games like this, you kind of expect them to be, well, bad. But Game Freak actually did a pretty solid job on this one. It was even included on the Mega Drive Mini 2 in Japan, so this game's legacy still lives on even to this day. So back to Nintendo for this next one. After being impressed with their work on Yoshi, Nintendo asked Game Freak to make a game that utilized the Super Nintendo Super Scope peripheral. So they put together a prototype where you shoot a net to capture monsters inside a mansion. Development was going fairly smoothly, but there was a small problem.
This thing don't fucking work.
Oh shit! Yeah, the Super Scope was kind of a big pile of garbage, so they shifted to using the Super Nintendo mouse instead. Now, up until this point, the game featured completely original characters, as Game Freak was hoping to build up their own roster of IP. However, eventually Nintendo asked to put Mario characters in the game instead. Game Freak agreed, as they felt it would help the game sell better. But at the last minute, they decided to sneak one of their original characters from the prototype back into the game, a small fairy named Wanda. Development continued with this new Mario identity and would eventually release exclusively in Japan on August 27, 1993 as Mario and Wario. The game has Mario, Peach, Yoshi, and Luigi exploring a forest in hopes of finding a magical fairy that supposedly lives there. While exploring, Luigi gets lost, so the group splits up to try and find him, but then... Well, Mario can't see shit now. So you play as Wanda, the fairy the group was originally searching for, as you guide each character through a maze to find Luigi, who can remove the bucket from their head. The game is controlled entirely with the Super Nintendo mouse, with Wanda acting as your cursor as you click on various blocks to steer the characters away from danger. It's basically the predecessor to the Mario vs. Donkey Kong series. It's pretty fun and surprisingly challenging. While the game was only released in Japan, there was definitely a plan for a Western release, with various promotions in the US clearly advertising the game. However, possibly due to the failure of the SNES mouse, those plans were eventually cancelled. Bringing the game over to the West would have been fairly simple though, with all the in-game text already being entirely in English. Also, the game's title screen uses an English logo, but hidden in the game's data is a completely unused title screen that features the Japanese logo from the box. So, like, did they accidentally put an English version of the ROM on the cartridge by mistake? Don't fucking know, but sure does seem like it. But anyways, Mario and Wario. Pretty fun puzzle game, and definitely one of the better uses of the SNES mouse. Next up, we got Nantan. It's a puzzle game based on a kid.
Oh shit, here comes Pulseman!
This game is weird, psychedelic, 90s as all hell, and I absolutely love it. Pulseman is a platform action game released in 1994 for the Mega Drive. The game starts with Dr. Yoshiyama, who just finished creating an artificial intelligence called Sea Life. So, being the absolute degenerate he is, he falls in love with his creation and digitizes himself to be closer with her, which results in a half AI, half human boy being born named Pulseman. So yeah, they fucking in there. Then, according to some iterations of the story, due to being digitized for so long, the doctor's mind becomes corrupt, which results in him returning to the real world to spread cyber terrorism across the world. Oh god, not the arcade! So Pulseman has to travel the world in order to put a stop to his father's plans. Yeah, so they're really fucking in there, huh? So, on the surface, the game looks pretty basic. But the abilities, mechanics, locations, and aesthetics are what makes it really stand out. Ken Sugimori directed this one, and apparently wanted to make a game that could surpass Sonic the Hedgehog. You see, Sonic, he runs at the speed of sound, but Ken Sugimori's character, well, he's based on the speed of light, which is faster than sound, so yeah, go fuck yourself, Sega. You're constantly encouraged to keep your momentum going, as doing so will charge each of your attacks. Your punch becomes a projectile, and this shield thing becomes... This is kind of the main mechanic of the game. You can use it to attack enemies, bounce off walls, or just straight up fly for a bit. They even have these really cool bonus stages, which are just straight up breakout. The game is constantly coming up with new ways to use this ability, like traveling through electrical wires, breaking through walls, or just all around doing some cool ass shit. Pulseman is just straight up a really solid game. Honestly, one of the best on the Mega Drive. However, unfortunately, it was originally only released in Japan until 1995 when it had a temporary release in America for the Sega Channel service. But like, come on. Raise the hands of how many of you had the fucking Sega Channel. Thankfully, nowadays, it's more readily available, with releases on the Wii's Virtual Console in 2009, and more recently, a Nintendo Switch Online release. So, if you're able to, definitely go check this one out. It's well worth your time. So, while they were working on all of those games, Game Freak was still chipping away at that Capsule Monsters project in the background. Eventually, they'd have to change the name to Pocket Monsters because... Oh my god, I forgot the fucking monkey game, dude! Fucking monkey. Alright, so after 6 long years, Pokemon finally hit store shelves, and it was...
And Pokemon the
Pokemon
trading
craze,
card.
it has to be
Pokemon
the trading
disease and
card.
must-haves.
Video games.
There's no escaping Pokemon.
Yeah, it was kind of a big deal. Everyone's eyes were finally on Game Freak, but not because of Jerry Boy, Quinty, or even Pulseman. No, all anyone cared about was... So, of course, with such a massive success on their hands, Game Freak started work on a sequel. And then another sequel. And then another. And another. And enough. Game Freak had gone from a studio with a pretty diverse catalog of games to becoming basically a Pokemon sweatshop by the end of the 2000s. Pokemon isn't even fully owned by them either. It's jointly owned by Game Freak, Nintendo, and Creatures Inc., which all make up the Pokemon Company. Putting all your eggs in one basket like this, especially a basket you have to share, isn't going to be the most sustainable. Well, I mean, it is Pokemon, so maybe? Not only that, but Game Freak was, and still is, a company run by some of the most creative and passionate people in the industry. Ask any passionate artist to work on the same thing over and over again, and they're gonna get a bit burnt out. So despite Pokemon's massive success, Game Freak was still driven to push past it and find success in a franchise they could call their own. The first of these post-Pokemon titles was a game called Warriors: Legend of the Blue Dragon. This game features a pretty cool mix of genres. There's traditional adventure game stuff in the overworld, RPG mechanics, and these really cool turn-based battles where it's presented as a side-scroller, but everything still plays out in a turn-based fashion. Basically, the enemies only move after you do, and you're encouraged to finish the battles in as few moves as possible. Then you have the interesting setting of medieval Japan, the characters, and this beautiful sprite work based on Ken Sugimori's iconic art. Why didn't more people play this? Oh. Alright, so bad timing. Maybe their next game, Click Medic, will fare better. What? Yeah, basically anything that wasn't Pokemon wasn't leaving Japan for various reasons, and also wasn't doing Pokemon numbers. So Game Freak was forced to just put their little heads down and keep making Pokemon games. They put out 5 goddamn Pokemon games in 4 years. 5 games in 4 years! That's insane! And you have to keep in mind that Game Freak has always been a relatively small studio in terms of employees. You can probably guess that they were pretty drained at this point. They desperately needed a break from Pokemon. So after Pokemon Emerald was finished, they started on a project that would give them a much needed break from Pokemon. A game that, who knows, may even have franchise potential? That'd be pretty neat. That game was Drill Dozer. It released on the GBA after the DS had already been out for 2 years, and they didn't even bother putting it out in Europe. Game Freak, come the fuck on, dude! So, yeah, nobody really bothered with this one. Their fucking loss! Drill Dozer is like the coolest Game Boy Advance game ever. It stars a little girl named Jill. Yeah, that one. She's part of a gang known as the Red Dozers, who use a machine called the Drill Dozer to steal stuff. Then there's this rival gang called the Skulkers. They messed up Jill's dad pretty bad and stole his red diamond, which was a gift from Jill's dead mother. So Jill takes her trusty Drill Dozer out to take down the Skulkers and get the red diamond back. This is a side-scrolling action game. In it, you use your big old drill to, well, drill shit. Enemies, walls, screws, tunnels, it's all drillable, baby. The R button spins the drill forward, while the L button reverses it, which enables a surprising amount of puzzles and level gimmicks. Like these tunnels, which you have to drill a certain direction to get through. But you have to be quick when changing directions because there's a big spark of electricity that's chasing you. Then there's these catapult things where you need to drill into them and reverse to fling yourself up. The game is always introducing new stage gimmicks like this, which constantly keeps things fresh. Then there's these gears you collect to level up your drill, which makes the music go all badass and allows you to just go fucking wild. Drill Dozer really deserved better. It's truly one of the best and most inventive GBA titles of all time, and is a perfect showcase of just how creative Game Freak can be when they're not shackled to a single franchise. It really does suck because I honestly feel this game had franchise potential like Game Freak was probably hoping for. Maybe if it was released on the DS instead of the GBA, or given a better marketing budget, things could have turned out differently. But unfortunately for Game Freak, it was back to the Pokemon grind for them. 5 years and 5 more Pokemon games later, Game Freak finally had a new idea to break out of Pokemon Purgatory: the Gear Project. This was a studio-wide initiative which allowed any employee to pitch a game idea and work on it in between Pokemon projects. I love this idea. It enables every employee to freely exercise their creativity and gives them all a voice in the overall direction of the studio. The first project to be released under the Gear Project was 2013's HarmoKnight. HarmoKnight was pitched and directed by James Turner, the first Westerner to officially design Pokemon. As you can probably imagine though, directing a team of native Japanese speakers when you yourself are not could be pretty difficult. So to get around this, James apparently utilized his skills as a designer to just sketch out a lot of his ideas to get them across visually. Pretty creative way to get around a language barrier. So HarmoKnight is a rhythm platformer where you jump and attack enemies in time with the music. As a huge fan of rhythm games, yeah, fuck with Rhythm Heaven, I'm really into this and think the concept is pretty novel. But it's got quite a few rough edges. Firstly, for a rhythm game, it really doesn't have many songs, with each world only having 1 or 2, which are just repeated throughout. There's at least some Pokemon remixes though, which are pretty fun to play. Then there's the short length, boss fights, which all end up feeling pretty samey, and the extremely underutilized alternate characters. There's also just not much to come back to outside of the story. This game could have really benefited from leaderboards at the very least, or even some kind of endless mode where you're trying to get as far as you can without dying. Just anything to give this game a bit more replay value. But yeah, while HarmoKnight is far from perfect, it's still pretty fun with its fairly unique concept. It just really needed a bit more fleshing out. I'd love to see them revisit this idea in the future, maybe with a bit more of a budget and scope. Could be pretty neat. So a little while after HarmoKnight release, Game Freak posted this image to their website. What the hell is this? A new horse Pokemon? Are they teasing a new generation already? I mean, X and Y aren't even out yet. Apparently the text reads something along the lines of a classic game being reborn in a collaboration. So like a Pokemon crossover spin-off? That'd be pretty cool. Yeah, that. Pocket Card Jockey. It's horse racing that you play like solitaire. Now, I don't know if you could tell, but this game is strange. But holy shit, is it addicting. So basically, you play as a horse jockey that literally fucking dies during their first race. Damn, he did. But your guardian angel trainer promises to revive you as long as you don't, suck anymore. So the jockey is apparently really into solitaire or something and decides to approach horse racing like they do solitaire. And yeah, This is the game. It may seem a bit complicated at first, especially with the hundreds of tutorials the game throws at you, but it's actually pretty simple. You have the solitaire portion of the game and the horse racing portion. The better you do at solitaire dictates how well you perform in the race. Yeah, there's a bunch of other mechanics that all tie into this, but I'm sure y'all don't need me to sit here and explain how the fucking giddy up meter works. This concept is just so bizarre and doesn't seem like it should work at all, but it does, and like I said, it's extremely addicting. Definitely try this one. Right. Well, thankfully, in January of 2023, Game Freak actually remade this game, but it's only available on iOS and only if you subscribe to Apple Arcade. I mean, at least it's better than this game being lost forever. Thanks for nothing, Nintendo. So, at this point, Game Freak had a pretty solid relationship with Nintendo. Like, by the time Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire released, they'd gone basically 15 years making nothing but Nintendo games. To someone not in the know, it might have even seemed like Nintendo owned Game Freak or something. But fuck that, Game Freak don't need Nintendo. Published by Sega in 2015, Tembo the Badass Elephant was Game Freak's first game to release on everything but a Nintendo platform since Click-Medic in 1999. Yeah, remember this shit? This was pretty wild to see, considering how synonymous Game Freak had become with Nintendo. Tembo was the second Gear Project game directed by James Turner, and yeah, you can definitely see his style everywhere in this game. I'm a really big fan of his art. As you can probably guess from the title, you play as, well, the badass elephant, coming out of retirement to help the military with one last job, to take out an evil army. Tembo is like the embodiment of my ideal game. A super tight 2D platformer with a focus on speed and movement options. I've seen a lot of people compare this to Sonic, but I think the better comparison is Donkey Kong Country, with its focus on rhythmic platforming. Also, come on, that shit's just straight up mumble Ramby. It's definitely not perfect though. I'm not a fan of the mandatory collectibles, and the game is extremely short. But for the price, this is by far the best game that's come out of the Gear Project. I'm just a bit confused why they decided to put this out on every platform but Nintendo. This game just has Nintendo written all over it, so like, what's the deal? I mean, Tembo on Nintendo, come on guys, this shit writes itself. But I guess to be fair, this was during the Wii U days, so I can't really blame them for not wanting to invest in that thing. It'd be cool to eventually see an enhanced port on the Switch or something though. They could even include the DLC, which was never released. Apparently there was even going to be some Sonic crossover stuff too. Next up, we got Giga Wrecker, and yeah, I don't know about this one. It's got this really cool premise and art style, but I just, for the life of me, can't get into this one. It's a physics-based puzzle game with a light focus on combat. Basically, you can smash certain objects and turn them into big old balls, which you can use to solve puzzles or defeat enemies. I really want to like this game, but the physics just feel off. Maybe I'm just bad at the game, but I feel like I'm constantly having to reset the puzzles because the physics just never work how they're supposed to. Giga Wrecker originally only had a PC release, and I honestly feel like Game Freak had a lot of hope for this one, because 3 years later they released an enhanced console port called Giga Wrecker Alt, and yeah, I still have the same exact problems with this version. I don't know. This game is always going on sale on Steam, so maybe try this one out for yourself. Not my thing, but I could see some people getting into this one. Alright, so 2019. This was supposed to be a massive year for Game Freak. It was their big 30th anniversary. 30 years of making games. That's quite the feat. I mean, not many studios make it that far. So, of course, to celebrate, you had your usual new generation of Pokemon, but it was also announced that Game Freak was now prioritizing original Gear Project games over Pokemon. This would hopefully mean bigger budgets, bigger scopes, and just all around bigger games coming out of the Gear Project. While this news could be seen as disappointing for Pokemon fans, especially with the state the series was in at this point, I think this was 100% the right move to make. Not only does this give employees a much needed break from the Pokemon grind, but it also grants them an opportunity to learn about different platforms, genres, and gameplay experiences, and then bring that knowledge over to Pokemon. It's honestly an extremely clever way to foster professional development in a studio that arguably could really use it. So the first project to come out of this newly revitalized Gear Project was 2019's Little Town Hero.
More like Little Frown Hero, am I right, fellas?
Yeah, this game fucking blows, dude. I don't know, man. The characters are boring in one note, the game only takes place in a single generic village, and while the premise seems interesting, with the characters not being allowed to leave the town for unknown reasons, it's just executed in the most watered down way possible. But more than anything, I hate this battle system. Basically, it's set up like a card game where you're trying to break all your enemies' attacks by having a higher offense stat than their defense stats. Sounds pretty unique and kind of fun, right?
Okay, now we gotta talk about POW points, which are these
That's
red
the
things,
abilities
abilities
you
you
can
can
use.
use.
And this makes it so that
attacks are
it's
called
everything is based on RNG.
Those can only be
guts
used
meters,
once.
both of
Protects your
you
health.
break at the same time,
turn
and
into
turn
an
just
is it,
ends,
you
and
see,
the enemy's
it's
defeated.
because-
And yeah, that's basically it. Also, the whole battle takes place on a Mario Party board because why the f not? This is such an overly designed mess of a battle system, and these are long battles too. Some can take up to 30 to 45 minutes, and since randomness plays a huge role here with which attacks are available to you, you might just get a bad roll and fail the battle at no fault of your own. The more I played though, the more I started to see glimmers of something great here. The base concept of these battles is actually really unique and kind of fun. It's just all the extra shit piled on top that absolutely ruins any potential this all had. It's all just unnecessary. But for this game, I guess it can kind of be considered necessary, because outside of the battles, there really isn't much else here besides some mundane side quests for guys like Old Man, or Older Man. Honestly though, I feel kind of bad about being so down on this game. Because if you look into the lead up to its release, it becomes pretty apparent that Game Freak was really banking on this game performing well. They did live streams, released a fairly sizable special edition, and basically marketed this as their big 30th anniversary title. There was just this extreme sense of passion and confidence behind this game, almost as if they felt like they finally had something that could rival Pokemon. But unsurprisingly, it didn't even come close to that. Little Town Hero on paper sounds extremely promising, but they just completely butchered the execution here. Despite that, I do feel like there's still an opportunity here to take what worked and use that for future projects. I'd love to see a game with a better implementation of this battle system, a more fleshed out version of the story, and definitely more soundtracks by Toby Fox. God damn, that's some good shit. But with that, we're finally at the end of our little Game Freak journey. With Little Town Hero turning out the way it did, and with Pokemon, the future might not seem the brightest for Game Freak at the moment, but I'd argue their future is looking brighter than ever. While we've seen quite a few ups and downs in regards to the quality of some Game Freak's output over the years, I hope I've been able to show that when Game Freak hits, they're able to hit fairly hard. Games like Magical Taruruto-kun, Mario and Wario, Pulseman, Dozer, Pocket Card Jockey, and Tembo show just how talented Game Freak can be under the right circumstances. And those circumstances are a Pokemon fucks off for a bit. Let me explain. If you really dig deep into the company and their ideology, it becomes pretty apparent that Game Freak is an indie studio at heart. I mean, that's how they started after all. They're an indie studio at heart that's been stuck with the responsibilities of being a AAA developer, and I feel they've really struggled to keep up with that. They've been a bit of a victim of their own success, I guess you could say. In my opinion, they weren't ready for this. Pokemon was just some passion project Satoshi Tajiri had, and I think the fact that he's become a bit of a recluse in recent years shows that perhaps none of them really wanted any of this. Now, this is all entirely subjective, but I feel the quality of their games was a lot more consistent pre-Pokemon. Then Pokemon hits, and that's all they really had time for. Pokemon is a franchise that's only partially owned by Game Freak. The schedule of when these games need to be ready isn't decided by them. It's decided by the larger Pokemon company. This means they're forced to keep up with the Pokemon Company's schedule of all the merch, anime, and trading card tie-ins, which doesn't leave Game Freak much time to work on anything else, and because of that, we've definitely seen a dip in quality in regards to their non-Pokemon related titles, and recently we've even seen some dips in their Pokemon games as well. This is all in addition to Game Freak's persistence on keeping their studio relatively small as to not have too many cooks in the kitchen, and possibly to keep that indie spirit alive within the studio. But with the cost and workload of modern games increasing, I think Game Freak is finally realizing that this just isn't a sustainable way of running things anymore. Employees are getting burnt out, the studio is being stretched too thin, and game development, especially on the scale expected from something like Pokemon, is becoming increasingly more difficult. So, because of all this, we're finally seeing a lot of positive changes within Game Freak, mainly with their new prioritization of the Gear project, as well as splitting the studio up into two distinct teams. Team 1 prioritizes the Gear project, while Team 2 focuses on Pokemon. And I feel that Team 1 is the key to Game Freak's success in the future. Without the pressure of Pokemon, this team can take all the time they need to grow and work on new and exciting original projects, and use that experience to help the studio grow. While Team 1 didn't really have the best start with Little Town Hero, I feel like there's still a lot they could have learned from that project that can be used on Pokemon and other future Gear project games. Team 1's next game, Project Bloom, is set to launch in 2026, and I'm pretty excited to see how it turns out. So yeah, with this new studio structure in mind, I think the future is looking fairly bright for Game Freak, and who knows? Maybe sooner rather than later, they'll finally be able to grow beyond Pokemon.